There's a group of men you almost never hear about in conversations about modern dating. They're not complaining online. They're not arguing about relationships. They're not trying to fix the system because they're no longer inside it. Quietly, over the past few years, many of these men simply reorganized their lives. They focused on work, health, friendships, stability. And somewhere along the way, something unexpected happened. Dating stopped feeling necessary. Not because they stopped believing in relationships, but because they discovered something many people rarely talk about. Life can actually feel very peaceful when it no longer revolves around the search for one. And that raises a quiet but uncomfortable question. If relationships are supposed to be one of the most important parts of adult life, why do some men start to feel calmer after stepping away from the pursuit of them? To understand that, we have to look at something that rarely gets discussed. Not why some men leave dating, but what their lives start to look like after they do. For most of modern history, romantic relationships have been framed as one of the central pillars of adult life. It's the story many people grow up expecting. At some point, you meet someone. A relationship forms. Life becomes shared. And for many people, that still happens. But alongside that familiar story, something quieter has been unfolding over the past decade. A growing number of men are gradually stepping away from dating altogether. Not dramatically, not with announcements or public declarations, but with small, almost invisible changes. They stop using the apps. They stop organizing their weekends around the possibility of meeting someone. They stop structuring their lives around the search for a relationship. And when that shift happens, something surprising often follows. Instead of feeling emptier, their lives start to feel simpler, more stable, more predictable. At first, even the men themselves sometimes struggle to explain it, because the expectation has always been the opposite. The assumption is that if someone stops pursuing relationships, their life should begin to feel like something is missing. But what some men experience instead is something closer to relief. Not the kind of relief that comes from giving up, but the kind that appears when a constant source of tension quietly disappears. To understand why this happens, it helps to notice something most people rarely pay attention to while they're inside the dating world: the emotional rhythm it creates. Dating, especially in its modern form, doesn't just involve meeting people. It introduces a constant background cycle of anticipation, uncertainty, and interpretation. Messages waiting to be answered, signals that need to be interpreted, plans that might happen, connections that seem promising and then fade away. Each moment on its own may seem small, but when that cycle repeats over months and years, it creates a subtle psychological environment, one built around unpredictability. For many men, this becomes such a normal part of life that they stop noticing it entirely, until the moment it disappears. And when that background noise fades away, the silence can feel surprisingly peaceful. Consider someone like Daniel. He's 38. For most of his adult life, dating was simply something he assumed he should be doing. Not obsessively, but consistently. There were relationships here and there. Some lasted a year, some only lasted a few months. There were long stretches of being single, followed by short periods of trying the apps again. Nothing dramatic, just the normal rhythm many people experience. But over time, Daniel began to notice something subtle. Every period when he stepped away from dating, even temporarily, felt different. His weeks became more predictable. His attention stopped being pulled in multiple emotional directions. He slept better. His routines became clearer. At first, he assumed this was just a temporary pause, a quiet reset before eventually returning to dating again.
But each time he returned, something else returned with it. The uncertainty, the constant low-level question in the background of his mind. Where is this going? The emotional highs when something seemed promising, the sudden drop when it disappeared. None of it was catastrophic, but it was always there. Eventually, Daniel stopped returning, not because he became cynical about relationships, not because he stopped believing they could work, but because he noticed something difficult to ignore. His life simply functioned better without the constant search. And Daniel isn't unique. Across many different countries and cultures, similar observations appear quietly in conversations between men. Not in viral posts, not in heated debates, but in small, almost casual remarks. A friend mentioning that life feels easier after deleting the apps. Someone realizing they haven't dated in 2 years, and strangely, they don't miss it.
Another noticing is that once the search stops, other parts of life started expanding. Work improved, health improved, friendships became stronger. The structure of life began to stabilize. It's not that relationships became impossible. They simply stopped being the center around which everything else revolved. And once that shift happens, something interesting begins to unfold. Because when the search disappears, a different structure for life slowly takes shape. One where daily energy is no longer tied to emotional uncertainty. Instead, it begins to flow into areas where effort produces clear results. Work, health, skill, friendships, projects. Over time, these areas start reinforcing each other. Life becomes less reactive and more intentional. And that's when many men notice something they didn't expect. The baseline feeling of their life becomes calmer. To understand why this shift can feel so powerful, it helps to look at how dating organizes attention. Searching for a relationship is not just an activity, it's a psychological orientation. It subtly shapes how people plan their time, how they interpret interactions, how they evaluate their own lives. When dating becomes a central pursuit, many other areas of life begin orbiting around it. Schedules stay flexible in case plans emerge. Energy is reserved for the possibility of meeting someone. Emotional states fluctuate depending on what is or isn't happening in that part of life. For some people, this eventually leads to meaningful partnerships and shared lives, but the process itself introduces a certain level of instability because romantic connection depends on variables that are difficult to control: timing, compatibility, circumstances, reciprocity. And when a central source of meaning in life depends on things outside your control, the emotional landscape can become unpredictable. For some men, stepping away from dating removes that instability almost overnight. Suddenly, the structure of life becomes more clear. Effort leads to visible results. Work produces progress. Training produces strength. Time invested in friendships produces deeper connections. Life begins to operate on systems where input and outcome are more directly connected. Psychologically, that can feel profoundly stabilizing. The mind stops cycling through endless interpretation of signals. Attention returns to areas where effort reliably translates into progress. Over time, this creates a different baseline emotion: less volatility, less anticipation followed by disappointment, more consistency, more control over the rhythm of daily life. And slowly, many men begin to realize something they had never consciously noticed before. The search for a relationship had been shaping far more of their emotional world than they realized. And I'm curious about something here. If you've ever taken a long break from dating, did you notice your life becoming calmer or more stable in unexpected ways? Let me know in the comments, because a lot of men quietly report experiencing something very similar.
What makes this especially interesting is that many of these men did not initially plan to leave dating behind. Most of them simply stepped away temporarily. But once life reorganized itself without the constant search, something shifted in how they saw their priorities. Relationships stopped feeling like a missing piece. Instead, they became one possible part of life among many others. And that subtle shift changes how a person experiences their own future. When relationships stop being the center of life's structure, something else often takes their place: stability. For many men, this is the surprising part. Without the emotional turbulence of constant romantic pursuit, the rhythm of life becomes clearer. Days feel more predictable. Energy becomes easier to direct. Progress becomes easier to measure. And slowly, a different kind of satisfaction begins to appear. Not the intense emotional highs that sometimes come with romantic connection, but a quieter form of fulfillment. The kind that grows through routine, through consistency, through building a life piece by piece. Work improves because attention is focused. Health improves because routines become stable. Friendships deepen because time is invested without distraction. Over time, this creates a kind of life architecture, a structure that feels solid. And once someone experiences that stability, something interesting can happen. The urgency around relationships begins to fade, not because relationships lose value, but because they stop being the foundation holding everything else together. They become something different, something optional, something that can enter life without destabilizing it. For some men, this realization changes the way they see the future. Instead of imagining happiness as something that begins after meeting the right person, they begin building a life that already works. And if someone enters that life, the relationship becomes an addition rather than a solution.
This shift may seem subtle, but psychologically, it's enormous. Because it replaces a life built around pursuit with a life built around stability. And perhaps that's the quiet insight many of these men eventually arrive at. They didn't leave dating because they stopped believing in relationships. They stepped away because they discovered something else. A life organized around peace can feel surprisingly complete. Which raises an interesting question. If more men begin discovering that their lives function well without constantly searching for relationships, what might that mean for the future of how relationships form? No one really knows yet, but it does suggest that something subtle may be changing in how some men organize their lives, not around chasing connection, but around building stability first, and then allowing the rest of life to grow from there. If these kinds of reflections about modern relationships and the changing experience of men are interesting to you, consider subscribing to the channel. Because here we explore the patterns many people sense in their lives, but rarely see clearly explained. And sometimes understanding those patterns can change the way we see our own experiences. There is another part of this story that often remains invisible. What happens internally after a man has spent enough time living outside the dating cycle? Because the first stage is usually relief. The second stage is adjustment. But the third stage is something deeper: clarity. When the emotional noise of constant romantic pursuit fades away, many men begin to notice how much mental space suddenly opens up. Decisions become simpler. Daily life becomes easier to structure. Energy is no longer divided between multiple uncertain possibilities. Instead, attention returns to the parts of life that respond directly to effort. And over time, this changes how a man evaluates his own life. For many years, modern culture has quietly framed relationships as a kind of milestone, something that confirms life is moving in the right direction. Without it, many people feel as if something important has not yet begun.
But when someone spends enough time building a stable life without that milestone, an interesting shift can happen. The timeline itself begins to dissolve. Life no longer feels like it is waiting for something. It is already happening. This realization can be surprisingly powerful because it removes a subtle pressure that many men carry for years without realizing it. The pressure to constantly search, to constantly try again, to constantly believe that happiness is just one successful relationship away. Once that pressure disappears, the emotional landscape changes. Life begins to feel less like a race and more like a process. And for some men, that shift creates a kind of psychological breathing room they had not experienced before. They wake up knowing what their day will look like. They move through routines that make sense. They invest energy into things that steadily improve over time. And slowly, a quiet confidence begins to grow. Not the confidence that comes from validation, but the confidence that comes from stability, from knowing that life works, even without constant romantic uncertainty. That realization often surprises people when they first encounter it, because it challenges a deeply embedded assumption, the assumption that romantic relationships are the primary source of meaning in adult life. For some men, they certainly are, but for others, meaning begins to emerge from a different structure entirely, from autonomy, from mastery, from friendships, from the quiet satisfaction of building something stable. And once someone begins experiencing life through that structure, returning to the old emotional rhythm of constant romantic pursuit can start to feel unnecessary. This doesn't mean these men reject the idea of relationships. In fact, many of them remain open to the possibility. But the relationship itself is no longer carrying the weight of their entire life. It is no longer expected to solve loneliness or provide identity or bring structure to their future. Instead, it becomes something simpler, a connection that can emerge naturally if the circumstances align, and if it doesn't, life continues to function. That difference may seem small, but psychologically it changes everything. Because when a relationship is no longer responsible for holding life together, it stops being something that must be pursued at all costs, and that removes an enormous amount of pressure. Some men describe this moment almost like stepping off a treadmill they didn't realize they were running on. For years, they were moving forward, trying, adjusting, starting again, but always within the same emotional cycle. Once they step away long enough, they begin to see the pattern more clearly, and they realize something that once felt impossible. Life can move forward without it. Careers evolve, friendships grow stronger, personal goals take shape.
And the days begin to feel less like waiting and more like living. In many ways, this shift reflects a broader change happening quietly among some men today. Instead of structuring their entire future around the pursuit of relationships, they're experimenting with a different model of adulthood, one where stability comes first, where identity is built through personal progress rather than romantic success, where peace becomes a guiding value. And in that model, relationships are still welcome, but they are no longer required for life to feel meaningful. For many men, discovering that possibility changes how they see everything that came before. The years of searching, the emotional highs and lows, the sense that something important had not yet worked out. Those experiences start to look different when viewed from a life that is already stable. Instead of feeling like failure, they begin to feel like part of a process that eventually led somewhere unexpected. A quieter life, but often a more peaceful one. Of course, this path is not the same for everyone. Many men still hope to build long-term relationships. Many still believe deeply in the value of partnership and family. And for countless people, those relationships remain one of the most meaningful parts of life. But the quiet emergence of another path is worth noticing, a path where men stop measuring their lives primarily through romantic outcomes, where peace becomes a valid goal in itself, where the absence of constant pursuit is not seen as failure, but as a form of balance. And perhaps that's why this phenomenon often remains invisible, because it does not produce dramatic headlines, it does not generate loud debates, it simply unfolds in quiet decisions made by individuals. A man who decides not to reinstall the apps, another who invests more time into building his career or improving his health, someone else who realizes that his daily life already feels full. These decisions rarely attract attention, but taken together, they suggest something interesting may be happening beneath the surface. Some men are quietly redefining what a successful life looks like, not through withdrawal from society, but through a shift in priorities, from pursuit to stability, from constant searching to steady building. And once that shift happens, something else often becomes visible. Life has more possible shapes than people once assumed. For generations, adulthood followed a relatively predictable script: education, work, marriage, family. But the modern world has introduced more variability into that script, and for some men, that variability has opened the door to new ways of structuring life, ways that emphasize independence, routine, friendship, growth, and above all, peace. Whether this shift grows larger in the future is still unclear, but what is clear is that many men are beginning to ask a different question than the one they asked before. Not how do I make dating work, but something more fundamental. What kind of life actually feels good to live? And sometimes the answer they discover surprises them, because it turns out that a fulfilling life does not always look the way people expected when they were younger. For some men, fulfillment still comes through partnership and shared family life. For others, it emerges through independence, friendships, and the steady progress of building something meaningful on their own. Neither path is inherently superior, but the quiet discovery many men are making is that peace itself has value. A life where the mind is calm, where the future feels stable, where each day moves forward with purpose. And once someone experiences that kind of life, the urgency that once surrounded dating can begin to fade. Not because love has lost its meaning, but because life has already found its balance. Perhaps that's the most interesting part of this entire shift. Some men didn't step away from dating because they failed to find relationships. They stepped away because they discovered something they hadn't expected, that a well-built life can feel complete even before someone else enters it. And if a relationship eventually appears within that life, it will no longer be the foundation holding everything together. It will simply be something meaningful added to a life that already works. And maybe that quiet realization is why so many of these men rarely talk about it. They're not trying to convince anyone, they're simply living differently. And for the first time in a long while, their lives feel peaceful. If this video made you reflect on the changing dynamics of relationships and modern life, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, because here we explore the deeper patterns shaping the experiences many people feel, but rarely hear explained.